A teenage girl slipped through the small door leading into the attic of her grandparents' farmhouse in the Midwest. It had been a long time since she'd been up there. She used to spend hours trying on her grandma's scarves and hats, pretending and wondering what life was like for her grandparents when they were young. As she made her way through the clutter, she saw across the dimly lit room a small chest, like a treasure chest. In all the hours she spent playing in this attic, she had never noticed it, now sitting in the middle of the room, perfectly situated in the sunlight streaming through a high window. She moved over to the chest, sat down, and slowly opened the lid. A note, carefully placed inside, was addressed to her. She began to read, "To my dear granddaughter. This grandfather's deeply concerned about his country. He's worried that people my age don't understand the values and principles that made our country great. He's not alone. Today, many Americans believe our country is heading in the wrong direction. In fact, according to a recent Rasmussen poll, 6 out of every 10 Americans believe our country is on the wrong track. Yet if you ask these Americans to tell you why they believe this, many wouldn't be able to. They just know something is dreadfully wrong. The truth is, we have drifted away from the basic and first principles laid out in our Constitution by our founding fathers. These principles were the framework of ideals for governing a free society. We as a nation have forsaken many of these principles, and we've adopted ones that are fundamentally opposed to the Constitution. We must return to these principles if we hope to get our country back on track. But how? How can we, my generation and yours, turn a nation back to principles many of us never knew or barely remember? First, we have to educate. My generation and the one before it never really learned these principles and the significant role they had on making our nation great in the first place. We all must know what these principles are and how they relate to the issues of today. Second, we need a clear and concise way to remember them, so we can communicate them to others, so we can defend them and apply them. Third, we have to begin to hold our politicians accountable. We must expect them to lead by these principles. This means we must become less political-minded and more principle-minded. So today, through the words and passions of a wise grandfather, I want to reintroduce you to 5 of these powerful and profound principles that can reunite, re-inspire, and re-engage God-fearing Americans like you and me at this critical time in our history, just as they did when they were first written into our Constitution. I've placed a few keepsakes in this old chest I want you to have, the grandfather's note read. In my last few years, I've become increasingly disturbed by what I've seen happening in our country. It grieves me to think about the sacrifice and pain endured by those who fought for our freedoms. Freedoms clearly outlined in a set of guiding principles that formed our Constitution. Each keepsake represents one of these principles. You may have never heard of these. They're no longer taught in schools, and our churches have long since forfeited their right to talk about them. But I'm hoping you will understand their profound relevance for today, and I hope and pray that you'll find a way to communicate them, somehow, to your generation before it's too late. The girl reached into the box and picked up an old pocket Bible, worn thin and barely held together. As she carefully opened it, she found written on the inside cover in shaky hand the following: "Before you look further, you must first understand that this nation was founded on a belief in God. Our Constitution was consciously and intentionally based on biblical principles. Anyone who says otherwise is either deceived or a deceiver. Anyone who tries to move away from this undermines the most fundamental of our country's values. Now, with this in mind, here are the 5 items that represent the principles I want you to remember." First, she picked up an old key. The note with it read, "This was the key to your grandma's and my first house. We worked hard, we saved our money, and my father helped us buy it. It represents the sanctity of private property. Owning property is a God-given right, not a governmental privilege. But your freedom in this area is eroding. Not only are cities and towns taking your private property through eminent domain for the good of all, but laws are being passed that take your hard-earned money, your property, and redistribute it for the good of others." A small bell jingled in the bottom of the box as she reached in to pick up the next note. This bell represents individual liberty. When I was young, your grandma and I chased the American dream. The spirit of our great land was to work hard, treat others with care and respect, obey the law, and enjoy real freedom. Today, individual liberty is viewed as selfish and socially irresponsible. Business owners who worked hard to get ahead, who employ others, who make our economy run, are now viewed as heartless capitalists who should be taxed more to pay for the privileges and entitlements for others. Leaning against the inside of the box was an old wooden ruler. Its note read, "This represents the rule of law. It represents the importance of laws that protect, not restrict your freedoms. Laws that restrict your freedoms but don't protect you and your neighbors are unconstitutional laws. Ones that change the definition of marriage, force you to buy something you don't want, and restrict your right to homeschool your children are unconstitutional, period." Wrapped carefully in a clean handkerchief was a gold coin. This coin represents a free market economy. Don't be intimidated by this. It's really a very simple principle, but a very important one. A free market allows you to buy goods and services according to supply and demand. In this system, companies thrive and companies fail. However, when the government begins to pollute this pure system through farm subsidies, bank bailouts, and unfair incentives, it creates an imbalance that must be countered or corrected. That in turn requires another action, and the economy soon becomes reliant on the government. An economy that becomes reliant on the government is an unfair system, void of entrepreneurship and ultimately fraught with corruption. Look around the world today and you'll see what I'm talking about. Finally, a small card. It was her grandfather's voter's registration card. I saved this all these years because it meant so much to me when I got it. It represents power. It was my ability to vote out any government that usurps its God-granted authority. It was my power to vote out any politician who believed it was his place to tell me what to do instead of allowing me to make my own choices. When your government begins to believe you aren't responsible enough to do what it wants you to do, it'll make you do it. You may soon be forced to buy health insurance, whether you like it or not. This is not individual choice. It's coercion. Don't let this happen. Fight for your individual choice. Coercion by the government is a dreaded slippery slope. We surely aren't following the principles outlined so simply and succinctly in these letters. This grandfather, like many others, is deeply concerned that people my age don't even know these truths, much less realize their significance. He's right. Many of us don't know them. So I ask the question again, how can we turn a nation back to principles many of us never knew or barely remember? We have to educate. We must know and remember these basic principles. The key that represents the sanctity of private property, the bell of individual liberty, the wooden ruler representing the rule of law, a gold coin of a free market economy, and an old voter's registration card representing our free choice over coercion. And we must hold our politicians accountable to uphold these principles, regardless of their political party affiliations. I hope this grandfather's simple illustrations will help you understand and remember these principles. And more importantly, I hope you'll join me in actively preserving and defending them. I know many of you may easily remember the good old days of the past, and you should. In fact, I hope you will say, "I am yesterday, and I will never forget." And I hope something is stirring inside you to say, "But I'm also today, and I will actively engage to defend and preserve these truths." Why do I so sincerely and passionately ask this of you? Because I'm tomorrow, and it's worth the fight.